I'm going to be talking briefly about some of the effects of climate change and why, when you hear the words climate change or global warming or the climate crisis, that you understand this is a human health issue. We are looking, by the end of the century, of warming somewhere between 1 degree centigrade on average to 7 degrees. And with our current energy policies, we are heading to that scenario or worse. It's not your imagination. Summers really are getting hotter. This is from 1915 to 1980, 83 to 93, 94 to 2004. Notice that the red, the extremely hot days, look what, the extreme hot days are getting more and more. And in the United States, we actually did a study looking downscaling to the United States, the eastern United States, and found that almost all cities east of the Mississippi will have 3 times as many very hot days, 90 degrees or 32 degrees centigrade. This is what will happen. New York City right now has 13 days that it's hotter than 32 degrees centigrade. By the middle of this century, New York City will have 39 days that's hotter than 32 degrees. Well, another issue with temperatures is the oceans are warming as well. And I gave a presentation on Monday in Chicago, and I woke up in the morning and the newscasters were talking about a triple threat, 3 hurricanes at once, right after the record-breaking Hurricane Irma, Category 5, came through, and that was right after Hurricane Harvey. There's a reason why these hurricanes are so strong. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the green line of sea surface temperatures versus the blue line, which is the power dissipation index, in other words, the strength of winds, and see that the strength of a typhoon or a hurricane is absolutely determined by the surface temperature of the water. When you look at these physical attributes of climate change, rising temperatures, sea level rise from thermal expansion of salt water and land-based glaciers melting, and hydrologic extremes in the water cycle, more droughts and more floods, those 3 physical attributes will cut across many exposure pathways that threaten our livelihood. Certainly heat waves, but also air pollution and aeroallergens, ground level smog ozone, temperature related, ragweed pollen, and asthma. Whatever the air temperature surrounding a mosquito is, that's the body temperature of the mosquito. So because of that, it's these vector-borne diseases carried by insects that are extremely sensitive. Dengue fever, malaria, Zika virus. These are highly sensitive to just a little change in temperature. Waterborne diseases, if we're talking about extremes in the hydrologic cycle, that means intense rainfall, flooding, contamination. And any of you who understand public health know that our health depends on adequate food and water supplies. So if those are threatened, that's very significant. And lastly, mental health and environmental refugees. After a big storm disaster, post-traumatic stress, but also younger people these days are stressed out about the future, thinking about the global climate crisis. And we keep learning about new problems. So for the medical students, hypertension and preeclampsia of pregnancy, very severe, a dangerous problem, that's emerging in parts of Southeast Asia from sea level rise and storm surge, bringing salt into the groundwater, salination of freshwater aquifers. Who would have thought of preeclampsia related to an effect of climate change? If you look at some models about summer temperatures, the bottom map is showing by the end of the century, everything in red has a 90% probability or greater of experiencing the hottest summer temperature in their history. And what does that mean for crops that are sort of growing in a climatic envelope? It can get too hot for crops. The number of people at risk for hunger could double. But there are some plants that are going to just do fine with higher CO2 and warmer temperatures. Poison ivy and ragweed, C3 crops, C3 plants, they do well. There are experiments that show that ragweed pollen increases with higher temperatures and CO2. And in fact, in the United States, we're seeing longer allergy seasons because of increases in ragweed in parallel to warming temperatures in the United States. This is looking at the country of Syria, and you can see that there's rainfall declining, temperatures are rising, and also the drought Palmer index, index for drought, showed that right before the Civil War, Syria suffered the most severe drought in the instrumental record. And of course, that civil war led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of migrants. This flooding in Bangladesh and with the in Myanmar, the refugees coming across. This is near one of the refugee camps. So there are some big issues regarding extreme storms, refugees, and if you intermix political refugees with some of these storm disasters, it's very destabilizing. And now there are all sorts of riots. Those countries most at risk from climate change are not the countries that caused the problem. This is a data-driven cartogram showing on the bottom the most climate-sensitive diseases, places with malaria, malnutrition, diarrheal disease. The top map is actually the source of the problem. The countries that are cranking out CO2, Australians and Americans emit about 6 times as much CO2 per capita compared to an average global citizen. The red line shows that even if the countries come through with their agreements, 28% reduction by Australia, 26% by the US, 40% by the EU, 64% reductions by the Philippines and Ethiopia. If the countries come through with their promises to quickly reduce carbon emissions, we'll still have warming of 3.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. And the impact scientists working on climate change have been saying for a long time that we need to get below 2 degrees centigrade warming so that ecosystems don't unravel, and that to avoid real damages, we need to stay below that 2 degrees centigrade mark. Well, that means we have to ratchet down quickly. But it's also an enormous health opportunity. When you think about what would it take, what action do we need to do to combat climate change? We need to have a clean energy system. And according to the World Health Organization, if you could have clean energy, you might reduce 7 million deaths every year. Food systems, there's a lot of waste and environmental and health problems with a high energy input meat-based diet. Or, I'm not against meat, but overconsumption of meat is a big problem. And then finally, transportation, designing cities for people rather than simply automobiles. There's an estimate of more than 5 million lives at stake because of sedentary lifestyles. So golden opportunities here for health. About half of those 7 million deaths are from outdoor urban pollution. About half are from indoor air pollution from dirty cook stoves. So 7 million people. Now, if we ask the question, how much will it cost to get to clean energy? This is a study out of MIT that asks the question about approaches to US carbon policies that are cleaner, and what would the effect of air pollution be? They estimate that the health benefits from reduced particulates, PM 2.5, fine particulates. When you reduce greenhouse gases, you also reduce all those nasty pollutants, right? You burn coal, it's greenhouse gases and all the harmful pollutants like fine particles that kill people and that harm people. the health benefit from clean energy here in the United States could be 10 times more valuable than the investment cost. We looked at the a scenario in China. What if China reduced their coal emissions from power plants by 32%? We estimate that over 1 million lives could be saved every year if China reduced coal emissions by 32%. What would it cost to remove a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere by having cleaner energy sources? And this study estimates it's about up to $30. Now, nobody wants to pay $30 for cleaner energy, but what happens when you remove 1 ton of CO2, you also remove those nasty particulates, sulfur dioxide, mercury, all sorts of other harmful pollutants. So in a climate change policy trying to get rid of greenhouse gases, at the same time you get rid of harmful air pollution. So much so that you would have $200 in health benefits from avoided mortality, hospitalization, absenteeism. You'd have that many benefits. So look at the price of solar. It's dropped 99% since the 1970s. And solar and wind prices have dropped 80% and 30% respectively in the past 7 years. Solar and wind are absolutely competitive. We show that if you could reduce 20% of vehicle miles traveled by cars, you'd save, in our region of the world, 2,500 cases of asthma, 860 cases of heart attacks, 525 deaths. And in our country, that improvement in pollution from driving 20% less would be about $4 billion in avoided mortality and health costs. In America, there are 1 million people working in near or full-time energy efficiency jobs, solar, wind, and alternative vehicles. That's 5 times more jobs than fossil fuel electric industry. So there are lots of jobs in renewables, and jobs plus income give you health. This is a report out of the International Renewable Energy Agency, and there are an estimated, this is in last year, 2016, 9.8 million jobs in renewable energy. You can see mostly in solar, then biofuels, hydropower, wind. You can see the types of jobs. Lots of jobs in renewable energy. And you can see, that China is really investing in this. Coal mining communities have got to be taken care of. Those coal jobs, they can't, that's a job, first of all, there are not many of them with mechanized coal, but also those people have been living in that area for a long time. Their whole family, many generations, have been digging coal. We have got to invest in job diversification and support coal communities. If we have a carbon tax, a price on carbon, it's got to be carefully constructed so it doesn't disadvantage the poor. Very important. Another sector where we've got lots of gains to be had, both environmentally and in our health, is in the food system and agriculture. A high meat diet is environmentally consuming and unhealthy. A high meat diet, you can see up top there, that's very energy demanding and it harms the environment. There's a high water demand, land use demand for high meat diet. And you go down to a low meat diet or fish diet, vegetarian and vegan. The lower you go on the food chain, it's much easier to get protein from these lower forms on the food chain. So this is environmentally a good idea. And if one example, if Britain halved its meat consumption, greenhouse gases would fall by 25 to 40%. Every region of the world, you're seeing major increases both in men and women in obesity. And obesity rates bring all sorts of chronic diseases, diabetes and other issues. So with this trend, you know, it's a no-brainer that exercise is healthy, right? And in the United States, if you compare cities with the highest level of active transportation, so walking and biking, those cities have 20% lower rates of obesity, 23% lower rates of diabetes than the less active cities. You know, recognizing climate change is a health challenge, even if you don't believe in climate science. You know, look at what happens when you go to a low carbon economy. You know, I'm reading off the list up here, you know, sustainability, green jobs, livable cities, clean water, clean air, healthy children, etc. And the climate skeptic over here, says, well, what if climate change is a hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So this is why, you know, clearly assigning a price on carbon is the right choice and an enormous health opportunity. And I argue that this is the health opportunity of the century. And it's whether or not you accept the climate change science. It's a great idea. It's a healthy idea to get to low carbon. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the panel.
To what extent do you think that the fossil fuel industry is still influencing politics?
Of course, they are influencing politics. There is a lot of money in politics from the fossil fuel industry. And I see this exactly parallel with tobacco. Tobacco pumped a lot of money into politics, denying that tobacco was dangerous. It took many decades, and there were huge disinformation campaigns from tobacco. I see this exactly the same thing. You know, fossil fuel is using the same playbook that tobacco used, and investing in disinformation, trying to not necessarily say climate change isn't real, but to say there's uncertainty. You know, they're sowing doubt. I think so. That's challenging, and we need to step up. We need the health community needs to step up and say this is a health issue. People need to step up, but at the same time, don't be talking doom and gloom all the time, because there are amazing opportunities here in health, but also in local initiatives, and there are plenty of places that are going to low carbon energy and saving a lot of money and saying, well, we don't care what the federal government's doing. We're going to go do this and save money. And with the price of solar, I mean, there's no stopping the local initiatives from happening. But for sure, we need to be vigilant as far as countering the disinformation messages coming from industry. At the same time, we need to talk to industry. And there are plenty of ideas about embracing industry. Certainly the private sector, many companies are coming on board. But as far as the fossil fuel industry, you know, can they become energy companies rather than fossil fuel companies? Even conservative investors are not investing in coal. They see, you know, there's natural gas is displacing demand for coal. Low solar prices and wind prices are, you know, coal's not competitive. So even investors that don't care about the environment or just want return on investment are pulling out of coal. Oil, you know, hopefully they'll pull out of that sooner. But, you know, I think we need an honest engagement with oil companies, but also understanding that there is some vested interest there.
Why is it that there are more power stations, coal-fired power stations being built in China right now than are being removed in the rest of the world? So China is the biggest single source of pollution, and China is taking on a massive coal-fired industry, which they're working on as we talk. So while you look at the photograph of that floating solar panel, which obviously is worthwhile, it's nevertheless not detracting from the amount of coal power stations that are actually being built.
China is sort of hedging their bets. They've got a huge population and a hugely growing economy. I don't think they can go cold turkey off of coal, but I've seen signals that they are getting away from coal, especially because of their terrible air pollution problem. So there's major movement in China signaling that it's going to be reducing coal, but I defer to the expert to say what the balance is. At the same time, they are the largest investor in solar technology. So they're hedging their bets, and I do believe they are slowing their coal burning, but
what are the opportunities for the health insurance companies to take on the fossil fuel industry, because they also have a big stake in insurance payouts for poor health?
You know, there has been a lot of movement in the reinsurance industry. They were the first insurance group to come forward and ask the question about risks from climate change and talking about financial risks from all the storms and disasters, weather disasters. So they were the first that really took this on, and the reinsurance industry is bigger than the oil industry. So the reinsurance industry is very worried about payouts. And the health industry, I think health insurance should be a great partner to talk about trying to reduce costs when you think about the global-wide risk across all those exposure pathways, how many people are at risk. I do know that the healthcare system is moving forward and taking a very strong climate change agenda. There's green hospitals movement. There's healthcare without harm, taking care of people today without spewing a lot of pollution for the next generation. So healthcare without harm. That actually came from burning, it used to be from burning IV tubing that created dioxin emissions. That's how it started. But now it's bringing on, burning fossil fuels and that. So, lots of room for the healthcare, health insurance to come on board on this.
We're in a fight for human civilization. We're not in a fight for the planet. The planet's going to be fine. Yet we are in a fight for what we have created over the last 10,000 years. A society where in places like Australia, we can live in incredible wealth and comfort. We can have children that we expect will live for 80 or more years. We have an unbelievable lifestyle that even a few hundred years ago, the wealthiest on earth could never have conceived. And the biggest threat to that is climate change. The figures are scary that Professor Patz and many others have put forward. What's most scary is that when it sounds like it's a linear path, it seems like it's manageable. But this is not a linear path. The reason we talk about 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees is that once we hit those points, the uncertainty around the implications of climate change escalate to such an extent that we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. We do not know what's going to happen. And trying to bring together health and welfare concepts with that as a background is very difficult.
Humans, for a number of reasons, are much better, more receptive, more understanding of a positive news story. You start talking too much doom and gloom, people will switch off and they won't do anything. They'll put their heads in the sand. We need to be really pushing this positive story. And if you look at a lot of the publications that have come out now, The Lancet and others, it's about opportunity. It's about that positive frame.
We're going to need a lot of compassion. We understand that climate change is something that, although it will affect whether you live in a city or rural area, in a mountain or by the seaside, it will affect everyone, but there are certain groups of the population that will suffer a lot more. These are vulnerable groups that will not be able to adapt. In Australia, pretty much everyone is going to be able to adapt, and the government probably will going to help those who cannot adapt to adapt, but there will be places where you just cannot.
The biggest challenges I see as changing the conversation and keeping and engaging people and allowing them to understand their power as an individual and their power as a small community working on the things that they can change. But getting behaviour change across a population is something that requires government support. It's public health work. It's the work that these amazing people do here. as public health physicians. And it's getting the campaigns out there, and it's getting the infrastructure, the town planning, every aspect of government needs to be working on this. And this is something that we're not seeing enough action at the moment.
We need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions something like 10% per year. Australia is projecting increases in carbon dioxide emissions till 2030. Another way of looking at it is halving carbon dioxide emissions every 10 years. We're in no place at present to do that. The urgency is overwhelming if we are to achieve less than 2 degrees by the year 2100. A couple of opportunities. We've heard about what can be done in the health sector, what needs to be done, the opportunities. Australia has shown a shocking lack of commitment at state and federal level, not just on climate change and the environment generally, but on health and climate change.
Isn't there a key question here around who is in government?
I think you could pretty much make a case that the fossil fuel industry is government at multiple levels. They're advising government, they're writing policies for government, they are advising on legislation. There's a continual revolving door of bureaucrats and politicians into and out of government and fossil fuel companies. I think there's a strong argument that for both parties, not just the Liberal coalition, but for Labour, that they are so intimately entwined that the fossil fuel companies are government in this country. But nonetheless, if we retain some optimism, then I think we do just simply need to work with both parties.
To get an idea of the influence of the Minerals Council of Australia in Australian politics, we're at the coalface literally of their power, because one of the things they have successfully built is a huge momentum in government through the current federal government to actively destroy charities who advocate on climate change.
How can we possibly retarget this whole issue to Greg Hunt and Brad Hazzard and the other ministers for health in terms of providing the facts that I've heard from Helen, certainly Jonathan? How can we re-aim our appeal and our advocacy perhaps to the health ministers and get them on side?
It's interesting because the ministry receives a lot of letters from the public, and very rarely something comes requesting action on climate change. People are more concerned about fluoride in their water, or a problem of air pollution, or a local chemical. But when it comes to these very big issues, for some reason, maybe they are addressing it somewhere else. It's not coming to health. And I think it's true that we have a program, but at the same time, the ministry will react to requests from the public. So if this sort of request for information or for action is not coming, very difficult to make the relevant recommendations.
As soon as you mention air or water pollution, they say, oh no, that's the Environment Minister, you're with the wrong person. It's very difficult to make the link in government, and it shouldn't be difficult. But it's this whole bigger picture thing that I was saying again. People can't see the bigger picture. They can't understand that our health is absolutely reliant on these things. People don't understand that twice as many people get killed by air pollution in Australia as are killed on the roads. You think about how we obsess about the national road toll. Air pollution is double that, but we do not hear about it. And it's a failure. It's our failure as health practitioners. It's the failure of governments to understand these bigger issues as well.
Individuals have an opportunity to use their voice for their political vote, which is extremely important. But also you have two of the biggest financial instruments in your life, your mortgage and your superannuation, that can have a really big impact. There are some super funds in Australia, and I'll point out here HESTA, the Health Employment Superannuation Trust, that is globally one of the best in terms of climate policy. I encourage you to, if that is your super fund, I encourage you to go to their site and look at their climate policy, which is available, And if you're not with them, look at your super fund, see what they're doing, and if you can't see it, approach them, ask them. They need support on this to develop new products and to develop new offerings for individuals. And if it's a self-managed super fund, go to your private wealth advisor. They also need to see this demand from individuals, and your banks as well, your mortgage. These are massive instruments, arguably the biggest in your life, and you have significant power to leverage this financial position with all of those organisations. And I strongly encourage everyone to go out there and talk to your financial people, your super or wherever, and really give them your voice as well and support what they're doing, and take a look at your financial position there as well.
We have incredible power as investors. We've all got superannuation accounts, we've all got a bank account, and fossil fuel divestment as a thing that people can do, I think is incredibly powerful. DEA co-wrote a report with CAHA called Investing in Health, and that outlines all the opportunities that both health organisations and also individuals have with their money. So make your money a force for good.
To get an idea around the power of divestment, $5.5 trillion has been divested from fossil fuel investment over the last decade. That has had a tangible impact on the sector.
Divestment is really important, and it's a really strong commitment. And there are many universities that, they're looking at federal funding going down, and they're worried about their finances, and several are at least taking a step of no new investment.
At the background of all this on a global scale, there are existing public health issues from existing pollution, from existing power plants and manufacturing and so on. Is that taken into do you take that into consideration with your studies and your costings, that existing health issue in the cost of cleaning up and improving the environment?
That is the foundation starting point of if, in fact, in the United States, if 200,000 people are dying every year from the current air pollution levels, if we were to cut down on that pollution and get away from coal-fired power plants, that would be a lower number that dies, and that translates to, if you get to that number to 100,000 dying, well, you've saved 100,000 lives because you've gotten to a clean energy. So you use the current pollution as a baseline. The price of gasoline and the price of oil, you all know about the health and environmental impacts are externalities. Give me one industry, say a manufacturer industry that is creating something for sale, and they are pumping out toxic byproduct into the river that goes down and affects the next community. There are laws for the Clean Water Act, for example, that require that industry to pay for the waste that it is dumping in that production. Well, the fossil fuel industry is selling gasoline and oil, and who's paying for the emissions that go up and harm people and the environment? They are not, that industry is not paying for the byproduct of the use of its product. So it's crazy that we're not bringing the health and environmental costs of burning fossil fuels into the evaluation, into the market. These externalities need to be absolutely on the table.
Thank you for making this session, I believe, successful in taking the lens that we're all a voice and we all become a stronger voice out of this. Thank you very much.